This is his actual bunker, and it really looks like kind of an Aztec.
Everyone knew the end was coming, but no one could really admit to it.
When the bunker door beneath Berlin was forced open, the air that escaped reeked of death and had been trapped since 1945. This was a hidden chamber locked away since the horrifying fall of Hitler's Reich. For decades, rumors about this place had been dismissed as lies or fantasy. But the truth is real, and it is far worse than anyone imagined. What researchers uncovered explains exactly why this bunker stayed buried for generations, and why its contents were considered too disturbing to ever reach the public. Berlin in flames, the last days of the Reich. By April 1945, Berlin had become a smoldering ruin. Soviet artillery never stopped. Day and night, shells rained down, collapsing buildings, setting entire blocks on fire, and filling the streets with smoke so thick it was hard to breathe. The once proud capital of Hitler's Reich was reduced to rubble. Civilians stumbled through shattered avenues, searching for food, water, and any corner of shelter that might hold against the bombardment. Many simply gave up and huddled in cellars, listening to the terrifying rumble overhead. Inside the city, the Nazi regime was collapsing in real time. Hitler had moved his headquarters underground into the Führerbunker, a fortified shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. With him were his closest advisors, secretaries, and loyal guards. From there, he issued desperate orders for counterattacks that no longer existed. He clung to the fantasy that reinforcements might still turn the tide. According to reports, Hitler's appearance had become disturbing. His hands shook constantly. His skin was pale and blotchy. His eyes were wide and red, and his uniform no longer fit his thin, weak frame. His lips trembled when he tried to speak with control, but he could never hold it for long before his voice started to rise. He would suddenly explode in fits of rage, screaming at the top of his lungs until his voice broke. He shouted about traitors in the Wehrmacht, cursed his generals for failing him, and demanded executions for officers he believed had betrayed the fatherland. He screamed that Germany had been stabbed in the back, that cowards were everywhere, and that if the war was lost, the German people deserved to be destroyed. His eyes bulged so far from his face that even the most loyal officers were frightened to look directly at him. Secretaries kept their heads down. Some staff reportedly began avoiding the main conference room altogether, afraid of being pulled into one of his violent outbursts. Outside, the Red Army was already at the gates. Soviet tanks were advancing street by street. The contrast between above and below ground was chilling. On the surface, chaos ruled. German soldiers who deserted were executed by their own officers, their bodies sometimes left in public squares as warnings. Firestorms roared across neighborhoods. Civilians described screams echoing through the night. As families were separated in the rush to escape Soviet shells, hunger and fear hollowed out the faces of those still alive. Yet below ground, behind layers of reinforced concrete and steel doors, it was a different world. The bunkers ran on electric lights. There were beds, maps on the walls, and the illusion of control. For Hitler's inner circle, it was a carefully sealed bubble where tragic reality was ignored. For those who sheltered in smaller civilian bunkers, however, it was no refuge of power. It was a waiting room for death. With food supplies dwindling and no way out, many knew the end was only hours or days away. Eyewitnesses would later describe the final weeks as a city drowning in fear. The ground itself seemed to shake constantly. The difference between the silence underground and the screams and gunfire above left survivors scarred for life. To walk the streets was to face fire, executions, and bombardment. To hide below was to feel the walls tremble and wonder if the ceiling would collapse. As the war reached its terrifying end, Berlin had been transformed into a hidden city beneath the ruins. And how exactly did that happen? A city built on secrets. By the late 1930s, Nazi planners were reshaping Berlin into something most people could not imagine. This was not just about buildings or streets. It was about creating a city that could hide a war. Adolf Hitler and Albert Speer ordered the city to be built with two faces. The first was what the world could see. The second was what lived underneath. Miles of tunnels were dug through the ground. These were not for public use. They were for weapons, for secret meetings, and for messages the enemy would never intercept. Large anti-aircraft towers were built in the city center. These were called flak towers. They had massive concrete walls and held heavy guns on top to shoot down planes. But inside, they were something else entirely. They had rooms for radio signals, backup power, and leadership meetings. These towers could survive direct bombings. They were made to be the last places standing. If Berlin fell, these towers were meant to keep the regime alive just a little longer. The people who built all of this were prisoners who were made to dig in terrible conditions. These men and women worked without safety, without food, and under threat of death. Many died while digging the tunnels, and they were replaced without record. Nazi planners never expected them to survive. Underground Berlin became something horrifying. There were long corridors that connected bunkers across districts. Secret staircases led to soundproof rooms. Some spaces were filled with telephone cables and radio lines. These were the communication bunkers that allowed orders to be sent even when streets above were destroyed. But not every tunnel had a real purpose. Some were designed to mislead. There were escape routes that led nowhere. Dead ends were disguised as exits. Some passages led to sealed rooms with no other way out. They were called security chambers. These were meant to trap or confuse enemies, spies, or anyone trying to escape without permission. After the war, a new problem started. What should be done with all these hidden tunnels and bunkers? The Allies and the Soviets already knew what had to be done. They began blowing up entire bunkers and buried the rubble to hide what was under the streets. Demolition crews were ordered to carry explosives deep into tunnels and bunkers. Many of them were young soldiers or local workers with no idea what they were walking into. They placed charges against the walls and ceilings. When the explosives went off, the ground shook violently. Thick concrete split apart. Iron staircases twisted like wire. Rooms collapsed instantly, sending dust and fire rushing out through the shafts. In some places, they poured fuel into the spaces first and set them on fire. The flames burned everything inside. Some workers said they heard screams trapped in the rubble. Others threw up from the smell that came out of the old air vents. People reported seeing body parts buried in the wreckage. Some broke down and refused to go back underground. After the explosions, bulldozers pushed broken bricks, bones, and blackened metal into the holes, and new concrete was poured. Sometimes a school or park was built on top. There was no record left behind. These decisions were made for many reasons. Some said it was for safety. Others believed it was to stop these places from becoming shrines to Nazis. And some suspected it was to cover up things no one wanted discovered. People in Berlin still walk across ground that hides these horrific bunkers. Under parks, streets, and buildings, entire sections of Nazi infrastructure are still hidden. Berlin is a city that looks rebuilt on the surface. Underneath, it is still full of secrets. And among those secrets, one story stood out from the rest. It spoke of a hidden bunker that was never found. No one agreed on what it was, but everyone agreed on one thing. If it was ever opened, what was inside would change everything. The Forgotten Complex. Beneath the broken foundations of a wartime munitions plant in northern Berlin, early surveyors once marked an unexplored underground structure. Some reports suggested that after the war, demolition teams collapsed the main shafts. Others said the area was used to dump rubble from bombed-out buildings until the ground swallowed everything whole. For decades, the site was left alone. Locals who lived nearby spoke in hushed tones about the ground. In the 1960s and 1970s, workers told stories of hearing hollow echoes when trucks rolled over certain patches of soil. Children whispered about flickering lights under the earth at night. And then came darker stories. Some claimed that Soviet soldiers who marched down into the shafts in the final days of the war never returned. No official documents confirmed these tales, but the rumors spread quietly, feeding Berlin's culture of ghost stories and unspoken wartime memories. By the 1980s, a generation of amateur explorers took an interest. With flashlights, makeshift maps, and little more than curiosity, they searched the industrial ruins. According to reports, some found narrow passages that collapsed into rubble after a few meters. Others uncovered ventilation shafts clogged with soil and debris, but no one ever managed to push deep enough to confirm the existence of the rumored complex. Those who tried described the air growing heavy and the walls shifting dangerously, as if the ruins resisted intrusion. As Berlin grew and redeveloped, the area was fenced off and slowly forgotten. The official story was simple. Nothing remained worth saving. Yet, the dark rumors carried on. Some believed it was just another unfinished project of the collapsing Third Reich. Others suspected it had been something far more deliberate, hidden away before the Allies closed in. And then, in the modern era, interest flared once again. With better technology, sharper maps, and an obsession with uncovering Berlin's hidden past, a small group of explorers stumbled on a narrow opening in the earth. Unlike the blocked shafts of earlier years, this one seemed to drop directly into a hollow space. For the first time, the forgotten complex was no longer only a rumor. What lay beneath was no ordinary shelter. The explorers believed they had found the heart of something far more secretive: opening the bunker. The effort to reach the buried site was slow. Modern researchers and local historians worked with extreme caution, aware that any mistake could cause the tunnels to collapse without warning. Soil samples showed signs of stress and pressure from shifting debris above. The deeper they dug, the more unstable the site became. After weeks of careful excavation, they finally uncovered the shape of what looked like a sealed entryway. Beneath layers of packed earth and broken concrete, a rusted steel blast door came into view. Its surface was almost black, eaten away by corrosion. The hinges were fused solid, sealed shut by rust and time. Nothing about it looked safe. Records indicated it had not been opened since 1945. The team prepared the first breach with full protective gear, oxygen sensors, and air filtration units. They worked in silence. No one knew what they would release. When the first crack opened, a foul rush of air poured out. It was warm, stale, and thick. The smell was so strong that 2 team members immediately stepped back and vomited into their masks. Sensors confirmed what they feared. Oxygen levels were dangerously low, and the air was filled with mold, decaying organic matter, and particles that had not moved in nearly 80 years. Once the atmosphere was stabilized and deemed safe, the first explorers stepped inside. Their flashlights shook in their hands. The air was still, but it pressed against their skin like a heavy blanket. The first chamber was silent and dead. The concrete walls were cracked wide open in places. Loose stones had fallen from the ceiling. The floor was uneven, covered with broken tiles, rust flakes, and fragments of wood. Along one side, rusted bunk frames stood at odd angles. their metal thin and warped. Mold had spread across the floor and walls like veins. Above the bunks, remnants of propaganda posters still clung to the walls. The faces were distorted by water damage. Some eyes had melted into the paper. Slogans were barely readable, faded and warped. But the most shocking detail was not part of the structure. It was the graffiti smeared across one wall in faded red paint. The words were Russian, some were names, others were insults directed at the Nazis. A few were threats. One read, "We found you." Another simply said, "Rot here." These were not just scrawls. They were probably warnings, left by Soviet soldiers who had passed through in the final days of the war. It meant the Soviets had entered, even if only briefly. And what they saw made them seal it shut. The silence inside the bunker was unnatural. Every footstep echoed. Every drop of water falling from the ceiling made someone freeze. As they moved deeper into the bunker, the atmosphere changed. It did not feel like a ruin. It felt like a trap. Then the relics began to appear. A pair of cracked boots, helmets warped by heat or pressure, ration tins flattened and scattered, as if dropped during panic. Everything looked abandoned in a hurry. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. What followed next would be harder to explain and far more disturbing. Disturbing remains of occupation. Scattered across the ground were pieces of Nazi uniforms. The fabric had decayed, but the faded patches and insignia were still visible. Some were burned, others torn. Near them, explorers found objects that should not have been there at all. A small wooden toy car, its wheels broken off. A pair of tiny shoes, no larger than a toddler's. These were not military items. Someone had brought a child into this place. The team stood silently around the objects. No one touched them at first. The presence of civilians changed the tone. This was not just a bunker. It had been a trap for anyone inside. The walls themselves told their own story. On several surfaces, researchers noted what looked like scratch marks. Some were shallow, others dug so deep into the concrete they resembled claw marks. Theories arose that those trapped inside may have tried to force their way out as air and supplies dwindled. In one hallway, words were scrawled in both German and Russian. One letter begged for someone to find the writer's wife if she survived. Another listed food rations and stopped mid-sentence. One read, "They locked us in." Another said, "No water, help us." Others were harder to read, written in uneven lines, as if made in darkness or by a shaking hand. The explorers said reading them out loud felt like breaking into someone's last moments. No one ever sent those letters because they were never meant to be read. In one corner of a side room, the floor was covered in shattered glass. Some of it came from broken medicine bottles. The labels were faded, but one still had the word morphine. Some believed this suggested suicide, an act of despair when escape became impossible. Without records, no one could say for certain, but the scene hinted at the extreme pressure faced by those left underground. More evidence showed that this place had held both soldiers and civilians. Some of the objects matched military use, others were personal items, like combs and rosaries. The empty ration tins told their own story. Most were dented and scraped clean. Not a crumb remained. People had eaten everything they could. Then they waited in the dark for help that was never going to come. In one larger hall, the floor carried a different kind of scar. The stone surface was blackened, and the walls carried the smell of scorched concrete even after so many decades. The marks suggested a fire, though its cause was unknown. Some speculated it had been set deliberately, either as a last act of destruction by those trapped, or later by soldiers trying to erase what remained. Whatever the truth, the scene left a lasting unease on those who entered. But the most chilling discovery lay ahead. In a section sealed off more completely than the rest, researchers would uncover what seemed to be the bunker's final, darkest secret: the disturbing find inside. This part was reportedly sealed behind a reinforced steel door, blocked by rubble and welded plates. When researchers finally forced it open, they stepped into a chamber that stopped them cold. Inside were skeletal remains, dozens of them preserved in the silence of nearly 80 years. The positions of the bodies raised immediate alarm. Several skeletons were found slumped against the wall, gathered near what looked like a sealed exit. Others were sprawled across the center of the room in unnatural poses. Some still had fragments of rope near their wrists, though most of the fibers had rotted away. The scene did not suggest peaceful death. It suggested terror and confusion. The bones told a darker story. A number of skulls had clear holes that resembled bullet wounds. Others were shattered, likely from blunt trauma. While the exact causes could not be confirmed, researchers agreed the deaths had been violent. Some speculated execution. Others feared the victims turned on each other in their final hours. In the middle of the room was a burned patch surrounded by charred bones and brittle ash. The remains had clearly been set on fire. Whether it was an attempt to destroy evidence or a desperate act of escape, no one could say. But the smell of scorched stone still lingered in the air, even after all these decades. Among the debris were rusted pistols, broken rifle parts, and scattered shell casings. The presence of weapons suggested a firefight had occurred, or that people inside armed themselves as tensions grew. And yet, even more disturbing were the markings found on the walls. The carvings and symbols left behind. Some of these carvings and symbols were unmistakable swastikas and the insignia of the Reich. These symbols of loyalty were carved even as the regime collapsed. But mixed in with them were far stranger shapes. Certain markings resembled runes, the kind linked to occult symbolism the Nazis were known to dabble in. Historians remain divided on whether these were desperate scrawls, an attempt to cling to ideology, or signs of ritualistic behavior in the bunker's final hours. Names and dates were carved as well. Many seemed to belong to soldiers or civilians, perhaps marking their presence before death. Some included full names, others only initials, as if carved quickly. A few were paired with dates from the final days of April and early May 1945. These inscriptions suggested that at least some of the people inside were aware they would not leave alive. One word supposedly appeared again and again, gouged into the wall so many times it stood out even in the dark. Vergessen, meaning forgotten. Why it was repeated remains unknown. Some suggest it was a final plea not to be erased from memory. Others argue it could have been written in resignation, in the grim acknowledgement that those trapped inside knew history would pass them by. Another section of wall bore something like a prayer or curse. The German words were fragmented, but read as though directed against their enemies in a final message laced with anger and despair. With each discovery piling up, the question grew heavier for the explorers. What kind of place had they uncovered, and whose forgotten story was buried within these walls? What the bunker really was. The strongest evidence suggests that this hidden site was originally connected to a munitions plant in northern Berlin. The location, combined with the design of the chambers, indicates it may have served several functions at once. It likely provided storage and communication space for military use, while also doubling as a shelter for factory workers and their families when bombardments began. In the final days of the war, such spaces often shifted in purpose. What began as a military facility could quickly become a place of confinement or refuge for anyone who happened to be nearby. This explains why the discoveries inside pointed to both soldiers and civilians. The mix of people in the bunker can be explained by the chaos of April 1945. Evidence points to uniformed personnel, possibly guards or officers, but also to workers, families, and even children. The presence of civilian objects, religious artifacts, and children's belongings shows this was not purely a command post. It became a cross-section of a collapsing city, where the lines between combatants and non-combatants had disappeared. Prisoners who had been forced to work in the plant above may also have been pushed underground when the Soviets advanced. That combination made the site both military and civilian in character, and it helps explain why the remains later appeared so confusing. The question of why these people died inside is more complex. Clear signs of violence were present, yet there were also signs of slow collapse, such as starvation and desperation. One explanation is that violence broke out after food ran out, leading to executions or fighting among those trapped. Another possibility is that outside forces intervened, either through summary executions or by sealing the exits after contact. A further possibility is that the people inside simply could not get out once the structure was damaged or blocked. These explanations are not exclusive, and the final hours may have combined them all. The remains suggest an environment where order had completely broken down and survival became impossible. If the Soviets were responsible for sealing the site, there are several reasons why they might have done so. From a military perspective, it was often faster and safer to close off a bunker than to storm it and risk more casualties. For soldiers hardened by years of Nazi atrocities, there may also have been an element of revenge, with sealing viewed as a fitting punishment for those inside. Political calculation likely played a role as well. A bunker filled with a disturbing mix of soldiers, civilians, and possible prisoners could have caused embarrassment or propaganda problems if exposed to Allied inspection. Erasing it by burying the entrances was simpler than managing survivors or explaining what had occurred. It also ensured the site could not later become a shrine or symbol for extremist memory. These motives together make the decision to close it understandable from their point of view, even if the result was horrifying. The symbols on the walls show another layer of what occurred. Some were clearly political, such as swastikas scratched in as declarations of loyalty, even as defeat closed in. Others carried a religious tone, with names, prayers, and pleas for help carved in shaky writing. More unsettling were the runic shapes linked to occult practices within the SS. These markings suggest a psychological collapse that pushed some inside to cling to ideology, others to faith, and perhaps a few to rituals that they believed could offer power or protection. The combination of political, religious, and occult imagery is unusual, and it may have been one of the reasons why the site was later considered too disturbing to preserve. The fire damage presents its own unanswered question. Burned floors and scorched walls could have come from combat inside, a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, or even a controlled burn carried out after the site was sealed. Each explanation fits parts of the evidence, and the lack of documentation means the exact cause cannot be confirmed. The Soviet graffiti also raises uncertainty. The mocking inscriptions suggest Soviet soldiers at least passed through briefly, but it is not clear if they found survivors or only remains. If they did encounter people alive, the decision to seal the chamber afterward may have been intentional, designed to contain and erase what they had found. What sets this bunker apart from many others in Berlin is the combination of evidence. Other bunkers were demolished, flooded, or left in ruins, but this one appears to have been deliberately hidden. The mixture of military, civilian, and possibly prisoner remains, combined with disturbing symbols and violent deaths, created a site that did not fit into any official narrative. Rather than let it become a rallying point for extremists or a focus of public outrage, It was buried and forgotten. This deliberate erasure is what makes it unique. It was not only a ruin of war, but also a record of a collapse so unsettling that both victors and survivors decided it should remain unseen. What do you think about this discipline? Comment down below.